In a library in Paris, there is a notebook that will kill you if you touch it with bare hands. It is the laboratory notebook of Marie Curie. It is kept in a lead-lined box. To open it, you sign a waiver. You put on protective gloves. The paper itself is radioactive, and it will remain radioactive for another 1,500 years. Because the woman who wrote in it carried, in her own hands and her own bones, enough radium to glow faintly in the dark. She won 2 Nobel Prizes. She discovered 2 elements. She changed what the human race knew about the structure of matter. And she did it while it was killing her. And while it was killing one of her 2 daughters, and while the other daughter watched from across the room, the only one who would walk out of that family alive, and stay alive for more than 100 years. How does the most celebrated woman in the history of science raise 2 daughters into the same laboratory that poisoned her and lose one to it, exactly as she lost herself? Tonight, 3 things the textbooks leave out. 1, the second daughter, the one almost no one remembers Marie Curie ever had, who lived for only a few weeks in the summer of 1903. 2, the scandal that broke in the French newspapers in 1911, the same month she won her 2nd Nobel Prize, that nearly ended her career and put her 13-year-old daughter in the middle of a mob. 3, what Ève Curie, the survivor, was holding in her hands in a New York apartment in October of 2007, at the age of 102, on the last afternoon of the longest, loneliest vigil in the history of one of the most famous families on Earth. Most people remember Marie Curie as a genius. Almost no one remembers what it cost her children. The first thing Maria Skłodowska ever learned about love was that it leaves the room and does not come back. She was 10 years old. The year was 1878. The city was Warsaw, which in that year was not the capital of a country, because there was no country. Poland had been erased from the map, partitioned among 3 empires, and the part Maria lived in belonged to the Russian Tsar. Children in her school were forbidden to speak Polish in the classroom. They learned their own history in secret, in whispers, with a lookout at the door. Her mother was named Bronisława. She ran a respected girls' boarding school. She was, by every account from the family, gentle, devout, and careful, a woman who, because of a condition no one fully understood at the time, had stopped embracing her own children years before, kissing them only on the forehead, eating from separate dishes, keeping a careful distance she never explained to the small daughter who could not understand why her mother would not hold her. The condition was tuberculosis. She had been dying, slowly, for most of Maria's childhood. She died in May of 1878. Maria was 10. 2 years before that, the oldest of the 5 children, a daughter named Zofia, had died of typhus, a disease she caught from one of the boarders the family had taken in to make money after the Russian authorities cost Maria's father his job. So by the age of 10, Maria Skłodowska had buried a sister and a mother in the same house 2 years apart, and had learned the lesson that would govern the rest of her life and reach down into the lives of her own daughters 50 years later. The lesson was that the world takes the people you love, and that the only safe place to put your heart is into work, into something that cannot die, cannot leave, cannot be taken by an empire or a disease. She stopped praying in those years. She had been a devout Catholic child. She came out of her mother's death an atheist, and she stayed one for the rest of her life. She turned, instead, to the one thing that had never failed her: the numbers. She was the best student in her school. She won a gold medal at her graduation at 15. And then she ran directly into the wall that her century had built for women. There was no university in the Russian Empire that would admit her. The doors were closed. She was a brilliant mind in a city that had no use for it, in a country that did not, on paper, exist. She made a deal with her sister Bronia. They could not both afford Paris. So Maria would work first as a governess for wealthy families for years and send her wages to Paris so that Bronia could study medicine. And when Bronia was a doctor, she would send for Maria. It took 6 years. Maria spent them in the houses of strangers, raising other people's children, reading physics textbooks alone at night by lamplight, falling in love once with the son of the family who employed her, and being rejected by his parents because she was only a governess. A humiliation she would never fully forget. In 1891, the letter from Bronia came. It was Maria's turn. She got on a train to Paris. She was 23 years old. She had almost no money. She enrolled at the Sorbonne under a new version of her name, the French version. Marie. Paris nearly starved her. She lived in a freezing attic room on the left bank, on bread and butter and tea, sometimes fainting in lectures from hunger because she would forget or could not afford to eat. She wore every piece of clothing she owned to bed in the winter, and still woke with ice on the inside of the window. She did not care. She was, for the first time in her life, inside a real university, studying real physics, with no Russian censor at the door and no family to bury. She finished first in her class in physics in 1893, she finished second in mathematics in 1894, and in the spring of 1894, in the way that the largest events of a human life almost always arrive sideways, by accident, through a mutual acquaintance who thought two quiet people might have something to talk about, she met a 35-year-old physicist named Pierre Curie. He was already a serious scientist. He had done foundational work on crystals and magnetism. He was shy, abstracted, indifferent to money and fame, the kind of man who forgot to eat when he was thinking. He had decided, years before, that he would never marry, that a wife and family were incompatible with a life given to science. He proposed to Marie within a year. She said no at first. She intended to go back to Poland. She intended to serve the country that had no university for her. She went home to Warsaw in the summer of 1894 and tried to find a place in Polish science. And Polish science, because she was a woman, had no place for her either. Pierre wrote to her. He told her, in a letter, that it would be a beautiful thing to pass through life together, hypnotized by their dreams. His dream of physics, her dream of physics, the dream of their country. He offered, if she insisted on Poland, to come with her and teach French there rather than lose her. She came back to Paris instead. They married in July of 1895. In a civil ceremony, with no white dress and no gold rings and no priest, Marie wore a dark blue outfit, practical enough to wear afterward in the laboratory, which is exactly what she did. They spent their honeymoon on 2 bicycles, riding through the French countryside. 2 years later, in September of 1897, their first daughter was born. They named her Irène. And 3 months after the baby came, Marie Curie did something that no woman in her position had ever done. She did not stop. She left the infant with Pierre's father, a widowed doctor named Eugène, who moved in to raise the child. And she went back into the laboratory, and she chose, as the subject of her doctoral research, a strange new phenomenon that almost no one in the world was studying. The mysterious rays coming off uranium. The laboratory they were given was a leaking shed. It had been a dissecting room, abandoned by the medical school because it was unfit for cutting up corpses. The roof leaked. It had no proper ventilation, no heating that worked, a dirt and asphalt floor. In the summer it was an oven. In the winter Marie recorded the temperature inside at 6 degrees above freezing. In that shed, over 4 years, working with tons of a black sludge called pitchblende, shipped in sacks from a mine in Bohemia, Marie Curie stirred boiling cauldrons of chemical waste with an iron rod nearly as tall as she was, in a chemical fog, processing the material by the ton to extract fractions of a gram of something no one had ever isolated. She found 2 new elements. She named the first one polonium for Poland, for the country that did not exist, a small permanent act of defiance buried in the periodic table forever. She named the second one radium for the rays it gave off, a substance so radioactive it glowed blue-green in the dark. She and Pierre would walk down to the shed at night, just to look at it. The faint light of their own bottles and capsules glowing on the shelves and the benches, like, as Marie herself wrote, faint fairy lights in the dark. They had no idea it was killing them. In December of 1903, Marie Curie became the first woman in history to win a Nobel Prize. In physics, shared with Pierre and with Henri Becquerel. She was the most famous woman in science in the world. She was also, in that same year, pregnant for the second time. The second pregnancy did not survive. In August of 1903, 4 months before the Nobel Prize, Marie Curie gave birth prematurely to a daughter. The baby lived only a short time. There is no grave anyone visits. There is barely a line in most biographies. The child is, in the public memory of one of the most documented families in modern history, almost entirely absent a daughter who arrived too early, in the middle of the radium years, and was gone before she had a name the world remembers. Marie blamed herself. She had been working in the shed throughout the pregnancy, stirring the cauldrons, breathing the fog. Her fingers cracked and scarred from handling the materials. She wrote to a friend, in a flat, exhausted grief, that she had been so attached to the little one, and that she did not know how she would work again. No one in 1903 connected the loss to the radium. No one connected the constant fatigue to the radium, the burns on their hands that would not heal, Pierre's legs, which had begun to ache so badly he could barely dress himself some mornings, Marie's exhaustion, her weight loss, the strange, dragging tiredness that never lifted. They thought they were simply working too hard. They were being poisoned by the most beautiful discovery of their lives. Marie Curie, at 36, had a Nobel Prize, a surviving daughter, a husband she loved, and a glowing bottle of the future, sitting on a shelf in a shed. She had no idea that within 3 years the husband would be dead in the street, that within 8 years her own name would be screamed by a mob outside her house, and that the small element glowing on the shelf, the one she named for the rays of light, would, across the next 50 years, reach into her own body and the body of her older daughter and take them both by the same slow hand. The light was already inside them. It had simply not yet been given permission to do its work. For a few short years, the Curie family was almost happy. The Nobel Prize money meant that, for the first time in her adult life, Marie Curie did not have to count every franc. Pierre was finally given a proper professorship at the Sorbonne. A real laboratory was promised. The leaking shed would, at last, be left behind. In December of 1904, a second surviving daughter was born, a healthy girl this time, dark-haired and lively in a way her serious older sister had never been. They named her Ève. The 2 girls grew up in a household unlike any other in France. Their mother did not believe in the ordinary education of the time. She thought the French schools made children sit too long, memorize too much, and think too little. So for 2 years, she and a small group of brilliant friends, physicists, mathematicians, a sculptor, pulled their own children out of school and taught them themselves. In a kind of private cooperative, each parent teaching the subject they knew best. Marie taught the physics. The children did real experiments with real instruments. They learned to swim, to cycle, to garden, to think with their hands. Irène, the older one, was her mother in miniature, quiet, literal, uninterested in small talk to the point of seeming rude. Hopeless at the social graces and brilliant at mathematics, she would sit for hours over a single problem with the same total absorption her mother brought to the laboratory. She adored Pierre. She followed him through the house, asking questions about numbers, about light, about why things fell. Ève was the opposite. Musical, charming, beautiful in a conventional way that her mother frankly did not know what to do with. Ève played the piano. Ève cared about clothes. Ève would grow up to be the only member of the family who never once set foot in a laboratory as a career. The changeling, the one who came out of the radium house and turned, deliberately, toward the world of art and music and words. Their grandfather, Eugène, Pierre's father, the old doctor, was the warm centre of their early childhood. He lived with them. He told Irène about the world, about politics, about the Great French Revolution. When the children's mother disappeared into the laboratory for 14 hours, it was their grandfather who was there. It was, for a few years, a good childhood. It ended on a wet street on an ordinary afternoon in April of 1906. On April 19th, 1906, Pierre Curie was walking across the Rue Dauphin in a heavy rain. He was, by every account, distracted. Lost in thought, as he always was, his body weakened by the radium sickness no one yet had a name for, his legs aching, his reflexes slowed. He stepped out from behind a horse-drawn cab into the road. He did not see the heavy wagon coming. The driver did not have time to stop. Pierre slipped on the wet cobblestones and fell, and the rear wheel of the wagon, loaded with several tons of military uniforms, passed directly over his head. He was killed instantly. He was 46 years old. Marie was not at home when they came to tell her. When she finally arrived and was told by a colleague at the door that her husband was dead, she stood completely still and then asked, in a flat, strange voice, exactly how it had happened. The position of the body, the wheel, the street, as if the precise mechanism mattered, as if understanding the physics of it could somehow contain it. Then she went silent. She would stay, in a sense, silent for the rest of her life. The Marie Curie who existed after April 1906 was not the same woman. The warmth, the cycling honeymoons, the fairy-light evenings in the shed, that woman died on the Rue Dauphin with her husband. What replaced her was harder, colder, more driven, more alone. She began keeping a private journal that she addressed directly to Pierre, writing to her dead husband as if he could read it, for more than a year. Irène was 8 years old. Ève was 16 months old and would never have a single memory of her father. And here is the thing that would shape both daughters for the rest of their lives. Marie Curie, drowning in a grief she could not speak, did not turn toward her children for comfort and did not offer them much. She turned, as she had turned at the age of 10 when her own mother died, to the only thing that had never abandoned her: the work. She took over Pierre's professorship at the Sorbonne, becoming the first woman ever to teach there. She walked into the lecture hall in November of 1906, in front of a packed crowd that had come to see history, and she began her first lecture at the exact sentence where Pierre's notes had ended. She did not mention him, she did not mention herself. She simply continued the physics from where the dead man had stopped. It was the most Marie Curie thing she ever did. And her two small daughters learned, watching her, the lesson she had learned, watching her own mother die. That grief is private, that love is dangerous, and that the laboratory is the one place that will never break your heart. One daughter believed it completely. The other spent her whole life running from it. Irène Curie became, in the years after her father's death, the most serious child in France. Her grandfather Eugène, who had raised her while her mother worked, died in 1910 when Irène was 12. So by 12 she had lost the father she worshipped and the grandfather who had raised her, and her mother was a distant, brilliant, grief-frozen figure who expressed love almost exclusively through mathematics. When Irène did a calculation correctly, her mother's face changed. When she did it wrong, it did not. This was, for the most part, the emotional vocabulary of the household. Irène learned to speak it fluently. She was not warm. She knew she was not warm. Throughout her life, people found her blunt to the point of cruelty. She would tell a colleague their work was wrong in front of a room, with no softening, because the work was wrong, and softening it would be a kind of lie. She wore practical clothes. She refused to flatter anyone. She had, by her teens, decided with total clarity that she would be a scientist, like her mother, and that nothing else about her life mattered very much by comparison. And then came the First World War, and Irène Curie's real education began not in a classroom but at the front. When the war broke out in 1914, Marie Curie understood immediately that X-ray machines could save soldiers' lives by letting surgeons see bullets and shrapnel inside the body. There were almost none near the battlefields. So she built them. She equipped cars as mobile X-ray units. The soldiers called them petites Curies, little Curies. And she drove them to the front herself, and she trained a corps of women to operate them. One of those women was her daughter. Irène Curie spent the war, from the age of 17, operating X-ray equipment in field hospitals near the front lines. Helping surgeons locate shrapnel in the bodies of wounded and dying men, sometimes under the sound of artillery. She trained other women to do it. She did the geometry of it in her head, the angles, the positions calmly, in the blood and noise of a military hospital. While she was still a teenager, she was decorated for it. She also, in those years, absorbed alongside her mother radiation doses that no one was measuring. And no one understood. The X-ray work, the radium, the endless hours close to the sources. Marie and Irène Curie spent the First World War, saving lives with the very kind of radiation that would, decades later, end both of theirs. Mother and daughter, side by side, in the same invisible rain. But before the war in the autumn of 1911, something happened that nearly destroyed Marie Curie completely and put the 13-year-old Irène directly in the path of it. Marie, a widow of 5 years, had fallen in love. The man was Paul Langevin, a brilliant physicist, a former student of Pierre's, married, with 4 children, trapped in a miserable marriage to a woman who, by many accounts, was violent toward him. Marie and Paul began an affair. They rented an apartment. They wrote each other letters of real intellectual and romantic passion. Langevin's wife found the letters. And in November of 1911, in the same few days that Marie Curie was in Sweden being awarded her second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry, becoming the first person in history to win 2, the French newspapers got the letters, and they detonated them across the front pages. The coverage was savage. She was called a foreign woman, a Pole, a homewrecker, a seductress who had defiled the memory of the sainted French Pierre Curie. Anti-immigrant hatred, anti-Semitic hatred, she was wrongly rumoured to be Jewish, and raw misogyny poured together into one of the ugliest public shamings of the era. A mob gathered outside the family home in Sceaux, throwing stones at the windows, screaming for the foreign woman to get out of France. Inside that house were 2 little girls. Irène was 13, Ève was 6. They were rushed out a back way to the safety of a friend's house, while crowds screamed their mother's name in the street as an insult. Marie, in Sweden, received a letter from a member of the Nobel Committee suggesting she perhaps should not come to collect her prize, given the scandal. She went anyway. She stood up in Stockholm and gave her Nobel lecture on radium and the chemistry she had founded, as though the mob did not exist, as though the newspapers did not exist. She refused, in public, to acknowledge that her private life was anyone's business but her own. Then she came home and collapsed. She spent much of the next year gravely ill, kidney disease, depression, hiding under a false name in a convent nursing home, unable to work, unable to face the public. For nearly a year, the most famous scientist in the world, more or less, disappeared. And the person who held the family together, quiet, blunt, 13-year-old Irène, watched her mother be torn apart by the public for the crime of having loved someone and drew, somewhere deep down, a permanent conclusion. The world could not be trusted with your heart. Only the work was safe. She had learned her mother's lesson perfectly. By the end of the war, Irène Curie was a young woman of 21, hardened by the front, brilliant, blunt, and utterly committed to the laboratory. She went to work for her mother at the new Radium Institute. And there, among the glassware and the glowing samples, she would meet a young engineer her mother had hired, a charming, witty, working-class man named Frédéric Joliot, the opposite of her in every social way. Together they would make a discovery that would win them their own Nobel Prize. And together they would absorb the doses that would, 3 decades later, put Irène Curie in the same grave her mother went to, killed by the same invisible thing, in almost exactly the same way, as if the radium had marked the whole family before any of them were born. Irène Curie married Frédéric Joliot in 1926. It was, by every account, a real partnership of equals. 2 scientists who worked side by side took both names, Joliot Curie, and shared everything, including the laboratory bench, where they would do the most important work of their lives. They had 2 children, Hélène and Pierre, named in the careful Curie way for the generations before them. And in January of 1934, in the laboratory, Irène and Frédéric Joliot Curie did something that had never been done in the history of the world. They created radioactivity. Until that moment, radioactivity was something you found in uranium, in radium, in the elements that happened to be unstable. The Joliot Curies discovered that you could make it. By bombarding ordinary stable aluminum with particles, they transformed it into an artificial radioactive isotope that did not exist anywhere in nature. They had, in effect, learned to switch radioactivity on. It was the foundation of all of nuclear medicine, of the radioactive tracers used in hospitals around the world to this day, of vast swaths of modern physics. Marie Curie was still alive to see it. The story goes that when Irène and Frédéric showed her the first artificial radioactive sample they had made, holding the small tube up to a counter so she could hear it click, the old woman, her hands by now so scarred and damaged by radiation she could barely feel with them, took the tube in her ruined fingers and held it close, listening to the crackle of the radioactivity her own daughter had created out of nothing, and her face, by the account of those present, lit up with a joy no one had seen on it in years. It was one of the last great joys of her life. In 1935, Irène and Frédéric Joliot Curie were awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the discovery. Marie did not live to see it. And the same discovery that won the daughter her Nobel Prize was, in the same motion, dosing her. The Joliot Curies worked with intense radioactive sources, with polonium, with the new artificial isotopes, in an era when protection was still primitive and the dangers were still half denied, even by the people who knew the most about them. Irène, like her mother before her, was absorbing, year after year, the invisible thing that had no smell and no warning and no pain until decades later the bill came due all at once. The marked family. The second generation. The same reign. By the early 1930s, Marie Curie was a ruin held together by willpower. She was nearly blind from cataracts caused, though she would not admit it, by radiation. She had endured multiple operations on her eyes. Her hands were cracked, scarred, burned, numbed by decades of handling radioactive material with no protection. She suffered from a constant low fever, from ringing in her ears, from a bone-deep exhaustion. She had spent 40 years inside an invisible fire, and the fire had finally consumed almost all of her. In May of 1934, she left her laboratory feeling unwell, saying she might go home and rest. She never returned to it. She was taken to a sanatorium in the French Alps. The doctors could not agree on what was wrong. They suspected tuberculosis, the disease that had killed her own mother. They were wrong. On July 4th, 1934, Marie Curie died at the age of 66 of aplastic pernicious anemia, a catastrophic failure of the bone marrow, the part of the body that makes blood. Her bone marrow had been destroyed by radiation. The radium she had discovered, named, isolated, carried in her pockets, kept glowing by her bedside because she loved the light of it the radium had, across 35 years, burned out the marrow of her bones from the inside, and finally left her body unable to make the blood that kept her alive. She was buried, quietly, in the cemetery at Sceaux, beside Pierre, no grand state funeral. Just the family, and a handful of friends, and her brother and sister from Poland, who placed on the coffin a handful of soil brought from Poland, the country that, by the time she died, finally existed again on the map, the country she had named an element for 36 years before. Irène was at the graveside. She was 36 years old, the same age her mother had been at the peak of her fame. Ève was at the graveside too. She was 29. She would later write the book that made her mother immortal to the general public. A loving, beautiful biography that sold millions of copies and won awards and shaped how the whole world remembers Marie Curie to this day. Neither daughter yet knew which one of them the radium had already chosen. After their mother's death, the two daughters' lives split into a perfect, tragic symmetry, two roads, out of the same poisoned house. Irène took the road into the laboratory. She became one of the most important scientists in the world in her own right. She and Frédéric continued their nuclear research work that came within a hair of discovering nuclear fission before anyone else. They made experimental observations that, had they interpreted them differently, would have given them that discovery too. She became a professor at the Sorbonne, like her mother. She became, briefly, a government minister, one of the first women in a French cabinet, appointed in 1936 specifically to advance the cause of women in science and public life. Even though, as a woman, she still could not legally vote in her own country. She was, like her mother, blunt, brilliant, politically fearless, and physically reckless with radiation. She handled the sources. She breathed the air of the laboratory. She kept working through pregnancies, through illnesses, through the slow accumulating damage that she, of all people on earth, should have understood better than anyone, because she had watched it kill her mother. She kept working anyway, because the work was the one safe thing. That was the family religion. That was the lesson, passed mother to daughter to daughter, since a 10-year-old in Warsaw decided that love leaves and numbers stay. Ève took the other road. Ève Curie became a concert pianist, a journalist, a writer, a war correspondent who reported from 4 continents during the Second World War. A glamorous and brilliant woman who moved through the worlds of art and politics and diplomacy with an ease her mother and sister never had and never wanted. She wrote the great biography of her mother. She never married until she was nearly 50, and when she did, she married an American diplomat, Henry Richardson Labouisse, who would go on to lead UNICEF and accept the Nobel Peace Prize on its behalf in 1965. Which means something almost no one realizes. Ève Curie is connected, by blood or marriage, to 5 Nobel Prizes. Her mother won 2, her father won, her sister and brother-in-law won. Her husband accepted one. She herself, the only one in the family who fled the laboratory, won none and outlived every single one of them. She was the changeling, the survivor, the one who got out. And the price of getting out was that she would have to watch all of them go. By the late 1940s, Irène Curie was sick, and she knew, with the cold clarity of a physicist, exactly what was wrong. It was tuberculosis, at first or so the doctors said, and she did have it, in the lungs, and she spent long stretches in sanatoriums in the Swiss mountains trying to recover. But underneath the tuberculosis was the other thing, the family thing, the thing she had been told all her life was the price of the work. Her blood was failing. In 1946, she had been involved in a laboratory accident, a sealed capsule of polonium that detonated, exposing her to a serious internal dose, on top of the decades of accumulated exposure that had begun when she was a teenager driving X-ray cars to the front. Doctors monitored her blood through the late 1940s and the 1950s and watched the numbers do exactly what her mother's had done. She kept working. Of course she kept working. She helped design and build France's first nuclear reactor. She helped found the French atomic energy program. She fought, politically, as a committed leftist and feminist in a Cold War that increasingly had no patience for either. She raised her 2 children. She climbed mountains in the Alps when her lungs would let her. She drove herself exactly as hard as her mother had, with exactly the same disregard for the invisible fire she lived inside. By the early 1950s, her doctors knew she was dying of leukemia. She knew it too. She was a nuclear physicist. She could read her own blood counts. She understood, better than any doctor in France, precisely what was happening in her bone marrow. And precisely why. And precisely how it would end. Because she had watched it end exactly this way, in a sanatorium in the Alps. In July of 1934, when she was 36 years old and stood at her mother's grave. She was living through her mother's death a second time. From the inside. In March of 1956, Irène Curie took a serious turn for the worse and was admitted to the Curie Hospital in Paris. The hospital named for her own family, founded on the science her mother created. She was 58 years old. The leukemia had reached its final stage. Her bone marrow, like her mother's 22 years before, could no longer make the blood she needed to live. The doctors gave her transfusions. They could not keep ahead of it. Frederick, her husband and partner of 30 years, was himself by now gravely ill. Also from radiation, his own body failing from the same decades of exposure at the same bench. He was too sick to be at her side as much as he wanted to be. He would survive her by only 2 years, dying in 1958. The radiation taking him too, the second of the pair the same way it took the first. Irène Curie died on March 17, 1956, of leukemia caused by a lifetime of radiation exposure. She died of the discovery her mother made. She died of the work that was supposed to be the one safe thing. She died at 58 of exactly the same cause, in almost exactly the same way, as Marie Curie, 2 generations of women, mother and daughter, the most decorated scientific family in human history. Both killed by the invisible light they spent their lives chasing, both of their bodies finally unable to make blood. Both of them having been warned by the death of the one before and having walked into the fire anyway, because the family religion said the fire was the only thing you could trust. The radium kept its appointment. It had simply taken 50 years to keep it. At Irène's funeral, there was one daughter of Marie Curie still standing, Ève. She was 49 years old. She had now buried her father, whom she never knew, her mother, and now her only sister. The brilliant, blunt, beloved older sister who had taught her things, fought with her, shared the strange radioactive childhood that no one else on earth could understand, was gone, at 58, exactly as their mother had gone. Ève Curie had escaped the laboratory. She had chosen music, and words, and the wide world. She had done everything possible to walk away from the thing that killed the women in her family. And the reward for escaping the strange, lonely, almost unbearable reward was that she would now have to keep living, and living, and living. Long after every other person who had stood at her mother's graveside in 1934 was gone. She did not yet know how long. She did not yet know that she had another 51 years to go. Ève Curie lived to be 102 years old. Sit with that number for a moment, because it is the whole tragedy of the survivor, compressed into a single fact. Her mother died at 66. Her sister died at 58. Her brother-in-law died at 58. Her father died at 46. Crushed under a wagon wheel before she could form a memory of his face. The radiation, the accident, the invisible fire. It took all of them young, and it took them in a cluster, the whole radioactive household burning down across a span of years. And Ève, the one who played the piano, the one who cared about clothes, the one her brilliant scientific mother never quite knew what to do with, walked out of that house and kept walking, for another half a century after the last of them was gone. She had been, in the years before her sister's death, one of the most accomplished women in the world in her own right. In 1937, 3 years after her mother died, she published the biography Madame Curie, written in French, translated into dozens of languages, an international bestseller that has never gone out of print. It is the reason that the general public, 80 years later, remembers Marie Curie not as a name in a textbook, but as a human being, a starving student in a Paris attic, a widow continuing her husband's lecture from the sentence where he stopped. Ève gave her mother to the world as a story. It is, in a real sense, the most influential thing anyone in the family ever did to shape how they would be remembered, and it was done by the daughter who never set foot in the lab. When the Second World War came, Ève did not hide. She became a war correspondent. She travelled to the front lines across North Africa, the Soviet Union, Iran, India, China, Burma, reporting from 4 continents, interviewing the leaders of the war, publishing a major book about the global conflict in 1943. She worked with the Free French. She broadcast against the Nazi occupation of her country. The musical, glamorous younger sister turned out to have, underneath the charm, exactly the same steel the rest of the family had. She had simply pointed it at the world instead of at the atom. She married finally, in 1954, at the age of 47, the American diplomat Henry Richardson Labouisse. 2 years later, she stood at her sister's grave. And then her real life's work, the long one, the lonely one, began. Ève and her husband devoted the rest of their lives to the world's children. Labouisse became the executive director of UNICEF, the United Nations Agency for Children, and Ève became his partner in it completely, traveling with him to more than 100 countries, into refugee camps and famine zones and war hospitals, carrying the work of feeding and vaccinating and protecting children across the poorest places on earth. In 1965, UNICEF was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and Henri Labouisse accepted it on the organization's behalf. Which means that Ève Curie sat in the audience in Oslo in 1965, watching her husband accept a Nobel Prize, the 5th Nobel Prize to touch her family. Her mother's too. Her father's one. Her sister and brother-in-law's one. And now her husband's, accepted on behalf of the children of the world. People began, gently, to call her the only member of the Curie family who never won a Nobel Prize. She would laugh at it. She had no interest in prizes. She had watched what the pursuit of the work had done to the women in her family, had watched it eat her mother's bones and her sister's blood, and she had chosen, deliberately, a different kind of life. A life of music, of words, of children, of service. A life that did not require her to stand inside the invisible fire. And she was rewarded for that choice with the longest life anyone in her family ever had, and the loneliest. Because the price of outliving the fire was outliving everyone in it. Her husband Henry died in 1987. Ève was 80. And then she kept living. For 20 more years. Alone, in an apartment in New York City, the last living person who had been held by Marie Curie, the last living person who remembered Irène's blunt voice, the last living link to the radioactive house in Sceaux and the mob in the street and the glowing bottles in the shed. Everyone who had stood at her mother's grave in 1934 was gone. Everyone who had stood at her sister's grave in 1956 was gone. The whole world that had made her was gone, and she remained, year after year, into a new century, into a new millennium, carrying all of it alone. She had escaped the radium. The radium's revenge was that it let her keep everything, her health, her mind, her memory, her century, and took, one by one, every single person she could have shared it with. There is something almost unbearable about the photographs of Ève Curie in her final years. She lived to see her sister Irène posthumously honoured again and again. She lived to see her mother's remains, in 1995, transferred to the Panthéon in Paris, the great mausoleum of French national heroes, making Marie Curie the first woman in the history of France to be entombed there on her own merits. Ève, then 88 years old, attended the ceremony. She stood, the last surviving daughter, and watched her mother's lead-lined coffin lead-lined because the body inside it was still radioactive, and would remain so for centuries, carried into the Panthéon by the honour guard of the French Republic, with the President of France delivering the eulogy. She was the only person there who had ever been that woman's child. She lived to see, in her own lifetime, the family laboratory notebooks placed in lead boxes because they were too radioactive to touch. She lived to see her parents' and her sister's deaths finally, fully understood by science for what they had been, not tuberculosis, not bad luck. But radiation, the slow accumulated dose of a lifetime, the bill that the most beautiful discovery of the 20th century presented to the family that made it. And she lived, herself, completely untouched by it. She never absorbed a meaningful dose. She had run from the laboratory as a young woman, and the running had saved her body and cost her everyone she loved. In her last years in New York, she was looked after by a small circle of people who adored her. She was, by every account, sharp, witty, elegant, and entirely present, almost to the very end, a woman who had interviewed Churchill and Gandhi and Nehru, who had grown up doing physics experiments with Nobel laureates as her tutors, who could remember being a small girl in a Paris suburb while a crowd screamed her mother's name in the street. She turned 100 in December of 2004. The tributes poured in from around the world. The last of the Curies, the last living daughter of the most famous scientist who ever lived. Crossing into her second century, she had 2 more years to go. Ève Curie Labouisse died on October 22, 2007, in her apartment in Manhattan. At the age of 102, she died peacefully. She died of nothing dramatic old age, the simple running down of a very long life, the one death in the entire family that the radium had no hand in. She had outlived her mother by 73 years. She had outlived her sister by 51. She had outlived her husband by 20. She had outlived, in fact, very nearly everyone who had ever known her as a young woman. She was the last person on earth who had been touched by the hand of Marie Curie. And when that hand-me-down of living memory finally closed, when the last daughter died in a quiet New York apartment in the autumn of 2007, something genuinely ended. Not the fame. Not the science. Those are immortal now. What ended was the human thread. The last person who could say, "I remember my mother's voice. I remember the way the bottles glowed. I remember my sister before the blood went wrong." That person was gone, and with her went the last living warmth of one of the coldest, most luminous, most tragic families in the history of the human mind. The obituaries called her the last of the Curies. They were right, but they mostly missed what was saddest about it. The tragedy of Ève Curie is not that she died at 102. The tragedy is the shape of the life that got her there. She is the daughter who did everything right, who saw the fire clearly, who refused to walk into it, who chose love and art and the wider world over the cold religion of the laboratory. And her reward was to stand, alone, at the edge of every grave her family dug for 73 years, holding the memory of all of them, with no one left who could hold it with her. She was the one who got out. And getting out meant being the last one standing in an empty house. Look at the 2 daughters side by side, at the very end, and the whole meaning of the story comes clear. Irène took her mother's road. She walked into the laboratory at her mother's side as a teenager. She made a discovery worthy of her mother. She won the Nobel Prize her mother won. She loved the work as her mother loved it, gave her body to it as her mother gave hers, and she died of it, at 58, of exactly the disease and exactly the cause. Her bone marrow burned out from the inside, just as her mother's had been buried young, mid-sentence, with the work unfinished, the family religion honoured to the letter and paid for in full. Ève took the other road. She refused the laboratory. She chose the piano and the typewriter and the wide, loud, living world. She kept her body clean of the invisible fire. And she lived to 102 and spent the back half of that enormous life utterly, structurally alone, the survivor, the rememberer, the keeper of everyone else's ghosts. 2 daughters. 2 roads out of the same poisoned house. One road ended in an early grave beside the mother. The other road ended in a long, long, lonely life. And here is the thing the family finally reveals when you hold both daughters in your hand at once. There was no safe road out of that house. The mother had taught both her girls, without ever saying it aloud, the lesson she learnt at 10 over her own mother's deathbed, that love is dangerous, that grief must be swallowed, that the only thing you can trust is the work. Irène believed it, and it killed her body. Ève rejected it, and it cost her every person she loved. The lesson was poison either way. because the lesson itself was the wound, passed mother to daughter, the real inheritance of the Curie family, more dangerous in the end than the radium. The radium took 50 years to kill Irène. The lesson took 102 years to finish with Ève. Both of them were dosed in the same house, by the same mother, with the same invisible thing. One of them just wasn't radioactive. There is a pattern in this family, and it does not begin in a laboratory. It begins at a deathbed in Warsaw in 1878, where a 10-year-old girl named Maria watched her mother, who had stopped embracing her years before, out of fear of the disease in her lungs, die without ever holding her properly again. The girl drew a conclusion that day. In the silent way children draw the conclusions that run their whole lives. She decided that love is a door that opens onto loss, that the people you are closest to are the ones who leave you with the deepest wound, that the only safe place to put your heart is somewhere it cannot be broken into work, into numbers, into a substance on a shelf that glows in the dark and does not die. She carried that conclusion to Paris. She built a marriage on it, and a method, and 2 Nobel Prizes, and a shed full of glowing bottles. And when her husband was killed in the street, she did exactly what her conclusion had trained her to do. She did not turn to her children, she turned to the work. And she walked into a lecture hall and continued physics from the sentence where the dead man stopped. Her daughters watched her do it. And they learned the lesson, the way children always learn the lessons their parents never put into words, not from what Marie said, but from what she did. Irène learned it and became her mother completely. The same blunt brilliance, the same reckless courage with the invisible fire, the same early death. Ève learned it and spent her whole life running from it, and the running saved her body but delivered her, in the end, to the exact loneliness the lesson had always promised. Love is loss. So she outlived all her love, and lost all of it, one grave at a time. The pattern was never the radium. The radium was just the part you could measure. The story of Marie Curie is usually told as a triumph. The poor Polish girl who conquered Paris, the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, the first person to win 2, the first woman in the Pantheon, the discoverer of radium, the mother of modern physics, the patron saint of every girl who was ever told that science was not for her. All of that is true, and none of it should be taken away from her, because she earned every atom of it in a freezing shed with an iron rod taller than she was. But that is not the whole story, and the part we leave out is the part that matters most to the people watching this tonight. The whole story is a family that could not hold each other. A mother who loved her daughters in the only language she had, the language of correct calculations and shared laboratories, because the warmer languages had been burned out of her at a deathbed when she was 10. 2 daughters who each, in opposite directions, spent their entire lives trying to solve the puzzle their mother handed them without words. How do you survive loving people who can be taken from you? One answered by giving herself to the work until it killed her. The other answered by refusing the work and outliving everyone until she was the last one in the room. Neither answer was right, because the question itself was the inheritance. The question was the radium of the soul, invisible, odorless, passed from one body to the next without anyone choosing to pass it, doing its slow damage across generations long after the person who first absorbed it was gone. You have this in your own family. Not the Nobel Prizes, not the radium, but the lesson, the unspoken conclusion that someone in a generation before you drew at their own deathbed, or their own abandoned doorway, or their own night of grief, and then handed down to their children in the things they did instead of the things they said. Don't get too close. Don't cry where anyone can see. Work is safer than love. Need no one, and no one can leave you. That lesson is still being passed down in millions of houses tonight. and it is still, quietly, doing its work. At the beginning of this story, 3 things were promised. The second daughter, the one almost no one remembers, was the premature baby girl Marie Curie bore in August of 1903, 4 months before her first Nobel Prize, in the middle of the radium years, with her hands cracked and scarred from the cauldrons. The child lived only a short time. Marie blamed her work. In a flat, private grief she allowed almost no one to see, and then she did what she always did with grief. She buried it and went back to the shed. The lost daughter is barely a line in most biographies, but she was real, and she was the first member of the family the radium years touched before Marie, before Irène, before any of them understood what the glowing bottles were doing to the bodies in the room. The scandal that broke the same month as the second Nobel Prize was the Langevin affair of November 1911, when French newspapers splashed Marie Curie's private love letters across the front pages. In the very days she was being awarded her second Nobel, and a mob gathered outside the house in Sceaux, throwing stones at the windows, while 2 little girls, 13-year-old Irène and 6-year-old Ève, were rushed out the back. The 13-year-old watched her mother be torn apart by the whole world for the crime of loving someone, and drew, in that moment, the family's oldest conclusion one more time. The world cannot be trusted with your heart. Only the work is safe. And what Ève Curie was holding in a New York apartment in October of 2007 at the age of 102 on the last afternoon of her life was the memory, just the memory. She held no notebook because the notebooks are radioactive and locked in lead. She held no sample because she had spent her whole life refusing to touch them. What she held, alone, was the last living human memory of Marie Curie. The sound of her mother's voice, the glow of the bottles in the shed, the blunt, beloved voice of a sister, 51 years dead. She was the last warm place that memory existed. And when she closed her eyes that afternoon, peacefully, of nothing but a very long life, the memory closed with her. The last of the Curies was not killed by radium. She was killed by time. The one thing the rest of her family never lived long enough to be killed by. Somewhere in Paris tonight, in a library, the notebook still glows. Not visibly, you cannot see it, but the instruments can hear it. The faint, patient crackle of radium-226, with a half-life of 1600 years, ticking away inside the lead box, exactly as it ticked away inside Marie Curie's pocket and Marie Curie's bones, and Irène Joliot Curie's blood. The numbers in that notebook are the numbers 2 women died to write down. The paper will be dangerous to touch until the year 3500 and something, long after everyone alive tonight is gone, long after their grandchildren are gone. The family's signature still warm in the most literal possible sense, still giving off the faint heat of the discovery that made them immortal and destroyed them. And 400 miles away, beneath the Panthéon in Paris, in 2 lead-lined coffins, lie the bodies of Marie and Pierre Curie. The lead not for ceremony, but for containment, because even in death, even decades and decades on, the woman is radioactive enough that the Republic of France must shield the living from her remains. She glows in the dark, still. She always wanted to. She used to walk down to the shed at night just to look at the faint light of the bottles. Fairy lights, she called them, the most beautiful thing she had ever made. She filled her own body with that light, year after year, because she loved it and because she did not believe, or would not believe, that the thing she loved could be the thing that was killing her. Her older daughter filled her body with it too, and went into the same darkness at 58. Her younger daughter refused it, and lived to 102, and carried the light only as a memory, and held it alone for 50 years, and then took it with her. There is a question this story does not answer. It is not, was the science worth it? It was. Cancer treatment, nuclear medicine, the radioactive tracers that find tumors in living bodies every day in every hospital on Earth, that is Marie Curie's gift, and Irène's. And it has saved more lives than the radium ever took. The work was worth it. No honest person can say otherwise. The question is older and quieter, and it is the one the two daughters were really asking, their whole lives, from opposite ends of the same poisoned house. Can you love the people you are given without being destroyed by it? Either by losing them or by refusing to need them at all? Marie never found the answer. She chose the work, and the work was magnificent, and her children grew up reaching for a mother who was always, in some essential way, already gone into the laboratory. Irène never found it either. She made the same choice and paid the same price, and died mid-sentence with the experiment still running. And Ève almost found it. She chose love. She chose the wide, warm world. She married late and well, and gave her life to the children of the planet, and reached 102 with her heart intact. And still the old lesson got the last word, because choosing love, in that family, meant outliving all of it, alone, for half a century. But here is the thing about Ève, the thing that is the small, hard gift at the center of this whole story. She did it anyway. She loved them anyway, knowing she would bury every one of them. She held the memory anyway, alone, for 50 years, when it would have been so much easier to do what her mother taught and feel nothing. That was the real discovery the Curie family made. Not radium. Radium was just an element. The real discovery was that loving people you are certain to lose is the one experiment worth running anyway. And that the bravest member of that whole brilliant, doomed, luminous family was not the one who won the prizes, but the one who simply chose to keep loving and keep remembering, all the way to the end of the longest life any of them ever had. If this story moved you, there is a reason. Somewhere in your family, there is a lesson no one ever said out loud. A conclusion someone drew at a deathbed, or a doorway, or a night of grief, long before you were born, and then handed down to you, not in words, but in the way they did or did not hold you. Work is safer than love. Don't need anyone. Don't cry where it shows. Keep a little distance, and nothing can hurt you. You may be carrying it right now without knowing its name. It is your family's radium, invisible, inherited, still doing its slow, quiet work in the marrow of how you love. Marie Curie could not see what the glowing bottles were doing to her body until it was far too late. You still can. So tonight, before you sleep, do the one thing no one in that brilliant, doomed family was ever able to do easily. Pick up the phone, cross the room. Find the person you have been keeping at a careful, safe, scientific distance because some lesson you never agreed to taught you that distance is safer than the alternative. And close the distance anyway. Knowing you will lose them. Knowing everyone is lost in the end. Knowing the experiment always, eventually, runs out. Run it anyway. That is the only discovery that was ever worth dying for, and the only one this family, in 3 radioactive generations, never quite learned to make in time. Don't wait until you are the last one in the room, holding the memory alone, wishing you had held the person instead. Hold them now, while the light is still warm, while it still glows.